If we go in and close off a field on the 20th of October, if we compare that to closing the same field on the 20th of November, we're going from 7.5 days of grazing in the spring for 50 ewes for every hectare down to 3.5 days of grazing. So we're nearly doubling the amount of grass we're going to have available for ourselves in the spring.
Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. In this week's episode, I'm joined by Grass10 Advisor Nikki Kennedy as we explore some key grazing management tips for the weeks ahead. Nikki discussed the latest in grass growth rates and covers around the country, offers some practical advice on management in challenging grazing conditions, and highlights the importance of sticking to the closing plan and the impact that can have on grass availability at turnout. We finish up with Nikki highlighting what farmers need to consider as we push the final weeks of grazing. We hear now from Nikki.
October we saw good growth, so that allowed a good bit of catching up, especially down in the southeast that were sort of behind on grass. We're looking at an average farm cover across dry stock farms there at 640 kilos, with low dry matters now with this recent rain at 11 or 12%.
So it did give a great chance for farms that maybe came into October slightly behind. It carried it through for them.
Yeah, absolutely. There would have been a lot of people looking at that thinking they weren't going to get much further, but a good growth has driven them on. So we were looking pretty good coming into November, but now we're sort of starting to see those challenging grazing conditions coming in. So there's a bit more to management now.
Yeah, it's certainly making up for. Look, you mentioned the low dry matter. I think anybody that's been around for the past week has realised that conditions are challenging. Utilisation has certainly gone down. Any tips for managing there, Nikki, where people are still trying to achieve graze outs, but those conditions become challenging?
Yeah, the graze out is always an important piece, but we're also looking at not damaging ground going into the winter and for the spring next year. So on wetter fields, we could be looking at doing things like going in, grazing, and if things are turning dirty, you feel like you're damaging ground, maybe pulling ewes off and moving them onto a fresh bite before going back if you do get better conditions. I know most of the country is in for a bit of a dry cold week, so you might get a chance to go back into those fields to get a proper graze out on them.
Probably one advantage with sheep, we can do that if it's just got that bit of soil or contamination on top, let it clean up for the couple of days. I suppose once it's not interrupting your closing plan, it is one way of getting that graze out on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm talking going back into things that you've just come off, not going back and regrazing things that you might not have grazed off properly, say closed up 3 or 4 weeks at this point.
No, I think it's important. Look, we do see some heavier covers out there where just is probably that bit more challenging getting that graze out. Look, you mentioned about closing up. In terms of that closing plan, Nikki, what are our targets for November? And maybe just chat to me a little bit about the importance of staying on track with that closing plan.
Yeah, so we're at mid-November at this point, so we're on track for trying to reach 60% by late November. A lot of people will be ahead of that, and that's fine. Don't get too worried about that. You'd want 60% by late November and 80% by mid-December. So it's important that we keep on these targets. Our effect of our closing date, so these are fields that we've closed and not returning to before the spring, has a massive effect on grass availability for turnout in the spring. If we go in and close off a field on the 20th of October, if we compare that to closing the same field on the 20th of November, we're going from 7.5 days of grazing in the spring for 50 ewes for every hectare down to 3.5 days of grazing. So we're nearly doubling the amount of grass we're going to have available for ourselves in the spring, which is that really high pressure period.
We think about the value of that. That's feeding it to ewes and lambs at turnout versus just trying to maintain a dry ewe at the moment. So there's a big difference there, Nikki. One is massively more important than another.
Oh, absolutely. We look at even the feed demand on a ewe at this time of the year is probably just over a kilo for our average sort of a ewe. And in the spring, we could be looking up at nearly 3 kilos. Never mind the sort of complexities of feeding or having to supplement ewes and lambs versus perhaps housing a little bit earlier and feeding that supplementary silage into a ewe, it's night and day on management.
No, I think, and the challenge will be there for some people. Like, we do look at that growth rate, despite the wet conditions, grass growth rate has been good. We've seen good regrowths in those paddocks, but that is really what's going to put that close and cover in place for us. Those fields that were closed in mid-October onward.
Yeah, absolutely. The sort of rebound, the regrowth of grass has been great, which is brilliant for building up that pasture cover coming into the spring. But it does become a temptation, I suppose, for a lot of people that maybe things have been closed up 3 or 4 weeks at this point, and you feel like there's a lot of grass, but that good growth rate will come to an end, and maybe it will with this cold weather this week, and we will go fairly stagnant on the growth over the winter. So don't be tempted to go back into things that you've closed up at this point, because you will be needing it in the spring.
That's money in the bank for springtime. Look, we're talking there about covers and our target of, our 80% close. I say most of us will probably end up being slightly ahead of that this year, just given the conditions. So just for those, Nikki, that maybe are starting to look ahead of them and say, mightn't just get as much of a stretch out of this as possible, could we still consider needing to keep some stock out? How do they prioritise, or why should they consider prioritising stock now if they are slightly ahead of target on getting through those paddocks?
Yeah, every farm is going to be different, so you're going to need to look at factors such as you might have 2 distinct lambing groups. So there might be a group of ewes that have finished mating. They would be ideal candidates to go in first, leaving any that are still out with the ram, or possibly leaving the rams out, or ewe lambs, either dry ewe lambs, they're a bit lighter on the ground, have a lower feed demand, or perhaps breeding ewe lambs that are being bred slightly later. Prioritise those ones to stay out and house those lower priority stock.
So it's no harm, Nikki, at the moment, maybe just assessing what covers are there and how many days grazing is left on the whole farm block.
Yeah, so people will take different approaches to this. You could go out and measure if you're measuring on the farm, or even just walking the farm and getting a good assessment, a visual assessment even, of where your covers are at, and sort of planning ahead. You're going to need to take into account if you get really wet days, it's obviously going to decrease how much grazing you're going to get out of those fields. But just to get an idea and sort of make a plan for yourself as to when you might be housing, so that you can be set up for putting ewes in houses and you're not caught out, not prepared, and ewes having to go back over closed up areas.
No, I think it's important. That bit of preparation, being able to house on a dry day as opposed to a last minute panic, is very important.
Yeah, exactly. If you're prepared and you can see that you've pretty much finished up and there's 2 days of dry left, and then there's going to be an absolute downpour, you're better off probably putting them in on those 2 dry days than maybe eking out an extra day and dealing with the issue of having wet ewes at housing.
Good point. Nikki, look, great having you on. Thanks for that update, and we'll chat to you again next month.
Thanks, Kieran.
We'll leave it there for this week's episode. I'd like to thank Nikki for coming on with us and offering some very useful tips for the weeks ahead, particularly highlighting the importance of sticking to that closing plan. I have included a link in the show notes to the Grass10 newsletter, where you can get weekly updates on the programme. To get updates from our sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow wherever you get your podcasts.